These are the hairy and downy woodpeckers. Though they may look the same, they're actually different species.
When you look at two very similar looking species like the hairy and the downy woodpecker, our first assumption is that they are closely related. That's not the case for the hairy and downy woodpecker. These two species are actually not related. They diverged from each other more than 10 million years ago. So why do they look so similar then? That was a question that the earlier ornithologists had, and they came up with a few hypotheses. The one that has the most support is the idea that the downy woodpecker evolved to look like the hairy woodpecker in a phenomenon that we call social mimicry.
This phenomenon was shown to be common in woodpeckers by a study published in Nature Communications by researchers at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where data on feather color, DNA sequences, eBird reports, and NASA satellite measurements of vegetation are used to study what determines the phenotype of all 230 of the world's woodpecker species. In this research, repeated cases of distantly related woodpeckers were found to closely resemble each other when living in the same regions of the world.
The idea behind the plumage mimicry hypothesis is that the plumage of a subordinate species like the downy woodpecker would evolve to match the color and the pattern of a more dominant species like the hairy woodpecker. When the downy does that and pretends to be a hairy, it scares off all the smaller competitors and gains access to the resources of that area.
We are high school students, Isabel, Mendelsohn, and Seowon back, with our mentor Lucas, Rocha, Moreira. We gathered data in association with the American Museum of Natural History's ornithology collection. We hypothesize that the phenotypical variation in hairy and downy woodpeckers would be spatially parallel and correlate with their environment. To understand the variance at the population level, we tested two ecogeographical rules, the Glogger's rule and the Bergmann's rule. According to the Bergmann's rule, birds living in colder areas should have larger bodies when compared to birds living in warmer environments, due likely to energy preservation. To test this hypothesis, we compared the measurements of bill length, tail length, tarsal length, and wing length of over 500 downy and hairy woodpeckers to the latitude and the environment in the locations the samples were collected. In both species, we see a positive correlation between body size measurements and latitude, and a negative correlation with temperature, indicating support for Bergmann's rule. Glogger's rule is the idea that birds occurring in more humid areas should have darker plumage than birds in cooler areas.
Normally, when scientists wanted to describe color in a bird, they used observation. They would take two birds and say, the color of this bird is darker than this other bird. However, we know this is very subjective and prone to errors. So a study conducted in the American Museum of Natural History in 2013 explored the possibility of using digital photography as a way to more precisely describe color in a specimen.
We adapted this method in our research and took photographs of several specimens to analyze the darkness of their bellies. In both species, we found that the darker plumage occurred in more humid places. Finally, we tested whether phenotypical variation is spatially parallel between the downy and hairy woodpeckers, which is a major assumption of the social mimicry model. We found that the downy and hairies do vary in parallel, meaning that the color of their plumage is geographically correlated. Our study reveals that both the environment and mimicry seem to have shaped phenotypical variation in hairy and downy woodpeckers. However, more data is needed to clarify which of these factors played a stronger role. Still, with this study, we make a small contribution to understanding how species evolve in response to the environment, which is necessary if we want to conserve biodiversity for the next generations.